Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for our Saints Talk, short presentations and lectures by leading members of our academic community on subjects we hope are of general interest. My name is David Williams and I look after the Alumni and Family Programme for St Andrews, and I'd like to welcome you this evening and to introduce you to Dr. Anindya Raychaudhuri. Senior Lecturer in English, Dr. Raychaudhuri is the author of 2 monographs, Homemaking, Radical Nostalgia and the Construction of a South Asian Diaspora, and Narrating South Asian Partition, Oral History, Literature, Cinema. In 2016, he was named one of the BBC's New Generation Thinkers in conjunction with the Arts and Humanities Research Council. His research interests include critical theory, Marxism, post-colonial studies, and memory studies. Dr. Raychaudhuri's talk today is called A Feeling Called Country, Oral History and the Landscape of Emotion in the 1947 India-Pakistan Partition. The content of his talk is a series of oral history interviews involving people's memories of the 1947 partition. Using this research, he explores how those who were there remember and express the most difficult and traumatic memories, including the experience and aftermath of individual and mass murder, from witnessing the suffering and death of a young brother to awareness of the murder of loved adults, such as teachers and grandparents. Some viewers will therefore find some of this content upsetting. Dr. Raychaudhuri will talk for about 20 or 25 minutes and then he will take questions. If you would like to ask a question, you can do so through the Teams taskbar. Please don't put your full name on it, as for data protection reasons, I won't be able to publish it. And now over to Dr. Raychaudhuri. Thank you.
Am I live now, Stuart?
Yes, you are.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Stuart, for inviting me to speak and for that very kind, generous introduction. As David pointed out, a lot of the material I'm covering today is difficult, is painful, but I think it is important to remember these stories and to honor them. And I hope to do that through my work. Before I start, I just wanted to say a word about the image that hopefully you can see on your screen. This is a photograph from 1947 or just before. This is, when the country, the landmass that is today India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, when that landmass was divided into India and Pakistan in 1947, all of the government resources, all of the government property had to be divided as well. And this is a picture of a library being divided. And I like this photo for a number of different reasons, but I in particular, talking about emotions, I think the look on that man's face says a lot to me as he's trying to decide whether a particular book is better suited to go to India or Pakistan. It is a warm, humid September day in 2013 in the village of Maan in the district of Gujranwala in present-day Pakistan. I have come to the village from the nearby city of Lahore for the day to do some oral history interviews with members of the village who remember the 1947 partition. There is one person in the village who is particularly excited to meet me, though we don't know each other. He has heard that someone from India is coming to his village to talk to him about partition. The first question he asks me when we meet is whether I can help him get a visa to go to India. He wants to see the home he left behind 7 decades ago. The crestfallen look on his face when I tell him I have no powers to grant him a visa is not one I will forget anytime soon. He is equally upset that as someone from Bengal, I'm not best placed to describe to him what Indian Punjab looks like these many years after he left. He talks to me at length about his memories of his village, but my abiding memory is his helplessness in the face, is my helplessness, sorry, in the face of his desire to see his village again, and the guilt I feel about the privilege of mobility that I enjoy. As a British citizen, I can go to India, I can go to Pakistan much more easily than Pakistani citizens can go to India, or Indian citizens can go to Pakistan. A few days later, I was in Karachi, one of the biggest cities in Pakistan, to do some more interviews. In between interviews, I took some time out to visit the Mazar-e-Qaid, which is the tomb of the father of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. I climbed up the marble stairs into the imposing mausoleum, and standing in front of the tomb, I suddenly realized with a surprise that was unexpectedly visceral, unexpectedly physical, that the various languages that appear on the tomb itself included Bengali. Of course, with hindsight, it is not at all surprising that Bengali should appear on Jinnah's tomb. When Jinnah died in 1948, the establishment of Bangladesh was still more than 2 decades away, and the Bengali language was very much a part of the Pakistani nation, at least officially speaking. By 2013, however, Bangladesh had been an independent nation for more than 40 years, and Bengali had for many years been seen as a foreign language. Even for an expat Bengali partition scholar like myself, the presence of the Bengali script was shockingly unexpected. The power of words had never been so real for me as it was then, as the achingly familiar script at once reminded me of my own home and highlighted how far away I was. I wondered how many people around me recognized the Bengali script and what, if anything, it meant to them. To me, apart from my personal emotional connections to the language, the material existence of the script serves as a visible reminder of the intricacies of partition, of what happened in 1947, and then how it changed again in 1971. Partition is an emotionally fraught topic, which is why one reason why doing an oral history of partition is also so emotional. Very few events in the 20th century have had as large scale an impact on life in the Indian subcontinent as the partition of 1947, which led to the formation of 2 states, India and Pakistan, what the scholar Meenakshi Mukherjee has called dissimilar but conjoined twins, unable to move away or to move ahead. Just a little bit of background history to remind you, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. As the British left India after more or less 200 years of colonial rule, the country was divided along religious lines, with Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east divided in 2. This map is a fairly schematic map, but the green bits in the map become Pakistan. The pink bits in the map are states or provinces of that get divided, and the pink and the yellow bits together form independent India. So Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east get divided in 2. West Punjab and East Bengal together form the Muslim majority state of Pakistan, even though these 2 halves, as you can see on the map, are separated by hundreds of miles of India, which had a Hindu majority. Partition led to perhaps the single largest population migration in human history. Estimates vary, but as many as 15 million people crossing the newly created borders. These photographs are from Life magazine. They were taken by the photographer Margaret Burke-White, who was working in the subcontinent at the time. The level and scale of violence was unimaginable. As many as 2 million were killed and more than 75,000 women abducted, raped, and or faced to convert. The emotional losses were also huge, as people had to leave ancestral homes, communities where they had been living since time immemorial. Most were unable to take any of their property with them. Some deliberately chose to leave everything behind because they were convinced they could come back at a future date. One of my interviewees in a particularly heartbreaking line says that his family had been living in that village for 600 years and they had to leave at 6 hours notice. Millions of people become destitute overnight. Returning home proves difficult or impossible as conflict between the 2 states intensified, leading to multiple wars in the past 7 decades. In 1971, East and West Pakistan, to go back to the map, the 2 green bits, East and West Pakistan divide again, leading to further violence and the independence of Bangladesh. The shock waves from this seismic event has radiated outwards through space and time, affecting both those who lived through the trauma and those like myself who did not witness the events but carry with them the post-memory of the horrors that ensued. That term post-memory is a term coined by the scholar Marianne Hirsch, who describes it as it's not quite history, but it's also not quite memory. It's the kind of memory that we inherit. So my family lived through partition. I'm the child of a partition family. Therefore, my connection to partition is that of a post memory. Every aspect of life in the subcontinent, religious, regional, political identities, community relationships, cinema, art, literature, has been indelibly marked by the events of more than 7 decades ago. For so many people, partition was and remains a defining moment, after which nothing would ever be the same again. So today's talk is part of a wider project on the oral history and cultural legacies of partition. And I wanted to do a sort of truly interdisciplinary study which combined public memories, so oral histories, and private memories, that is oral histories, with public memories such as literature and cinema and art and so on. And it occurred to me that these two could and should be compared together because they occupy the same world. And today's talk, I want to focus on examples of particular heightened emotions and the way these emotions are registered, are represented, are experienced, are enacted through the human body. And partition narratives are full of images of broken bodies, right? Tearing, cracking, bleeding, pain, in the words of scholar Claire Barker. As an example, David referred to this interview in his introduction. I'm going to play a clip from my interview with a gentleman called Zafar, who lives in Karachi and who's describing his memory of the death of his brother on a train on the journey from what is now India to what is now Pakistan. I'll play you the interview. The interview is in Urdu, but I've got the transcript in English on the screen for you.
मेरा एक छोटा भाई था, तकरीबन 2 साल का. उसके पेट में भाला न मारा तो ये जो इसका आंख को जो कवर करता है ना, झिल्ली, वो उसका सालिम था. तो उसका वो यहाँ से निकल आया, ये आते वगैरह निकल आई यहाँ से. मैं उसको लेकर गया क्योंकि इसका कुछ करो. वो देख के कहने लगे कि इसका कुछ नहीं होगा, इसकी तो आते बाहर आ गई, ये नहीं बचेगा. मैंने कहा फिर इसको पानी मत पिलाना. मैंने कहा क्यों? क्योंकि ऐसे ही कि पानी नहीं पिएगा तो ज्यादा देर तक जिंदा रहेगा. अगर इसके पेट में कुछ जाएगा तो जितना जाता जाएगा उतनी ये आते बाहर आती जाएंगी, हवा लगती जाएगी, मर जाएगा. मैंने कहा अच्छी बात कि वो पानी मांगता रहा. जब इसने मरना ही है तो यार प्यासा क्यों मारा जाए ऐसे? जब उसे मरना ही है तो इसे प्यासा भी क्यों मारू? बस घंटा बाद मर जाए, 1 घंटे पहले मर जाए तो कम से कम ये अजियत तो ना हो. अब पानी नहीं निकलते. वो जो इनके वो मतलब 2 नल लगते हैं उसके तो पानी के लिए बना देते ना, पानी गिरता है तो ड्राई ना हो. तो वो पानी जिसमें सिगरेटों के टूटे भी पड़े हुए थे, वो पानी ला के मैं उसे पिलाता रहा, वो पीता रहा. नतीजे ये हुआ कि रात 12-1 बजे तक अल्लाह को प्यारा हो गया.
It is noticeable how in the narration of the event, in the narration of the memory, the emotions that are rekindled through describing his brother's death end up written on Zafar's face, just as the violence of the actual death was written onto the little boy's body. As he describes the trauma, his voice breaks down at multiple moments in a way that is perhaps palpable across linguistic divides. There are, of course, other embodied bodily emotional moments that elude transcription or translation. The way he was sitting down, the way his eyes would fill up with tears until he relented and raised a hand to wipe them away, or indeed the ways in which a long and often painful life has left its mark on his body, lines on his face and his impaired mobility, none of this can ever be captured in the transcription of an oral history interview, or indeed in an audio recording. My oral history interviews are full of such moments of emotion that are difficult to access after the fact of the interview. Listen to Satya talk about her memories of a teacher who was murdered in Delhi, but who she remembers even today.
मेरी जो टीचर थी उसका भी कत्ल हुआ, ये मुझे नहीं मालूम कि किसने किया, कैसे हुआ, लेकिन सबको छुट्टी दे दी, सब अंदर घर में बंद हो गए और कर्फ्यू लग गया। मेरी टीचर का नाम बदर जहां था, आज भी मुझे याद। बहुत अच्छी टीचर थी, बहुत प्यार करती थी मेरे को। उसी कमरे में हम लोग क्लास बैठी थी ना, तो हमारे सामने तो नहीं, लेकिन हमको भगा दिया था वहां से। हाँ, स्कूल के बाहर से जब लोग आए थे ना, तो हमारी क्लास बैठी थी। जब हम शांत हो गया था 15 अगस्त के बाद स्कूल गई ना, तो दीवार पर ब्लड लगा हुआ था ब्लैक बोर्ड के पास। तो जब पूछा तो कहा कि उस टीचर का कत्ल हुआ था।
There's a hesitation in her narration. The flow of the narration gets more and more disjointed in the lead up to the memory of the discovery of the bloodstain on the wall and the consequent realization of the murder of her teacher Badr Jahan. For both Zafar and Satya, otherwise unremarkable spaces, normal parts of a familiar landscape, the classroom, the train, become laden with emotion, and the emotion is written on to both the bodies and the landscape. Badr Jahan's death is represented both through Satya's narration in 2013 and through the blood that was visible on the wall of the classroom in 1947. Zafar's overwhelming grief at his brother's death is both visible on his face and in his voice, but is also now associated with the dirty cigarette-filled water that was the last thing that his baby brother drank. Partition deaths, like deaths everywhere, happen somewhere in a specific location, and the landscape in which it happens takes on the emotion associated with the death. Even for people who never witnessed violence, partition remains an emotional event. In this clip, Jhorna is talking about her memories of her mother and her mother's pain of homelessness.
একটা কথা মজার কথা বলতে মাঝে মাঝে পাষাণ কোচনের কথা বলতে বলে 12টা ডিফারেন্ট সাইজের কড়াই আমি তাকের উপর ফেলে এসেছি, মানে কিছু রান্না করতে যে 12টা ডিফারেন্ট সাইজের ফেলে এসেছি। বাসনপত্র আর কিছু কাঁসার বাসন নিয়ে এসেছিল, সেই বাসনগুলো ওই দিকে ওই ছোট কিছু একটা করতে যেই মা বলছিস, এটা মা বুঝতে পারতাম কোনো কথা ভাবছে যে কত কলসি ছিল। একটা পেতলের কলসি কেনা বালতিতে বালতিতেই তো জ্বর হতো, একটা কলসি বড় যেদিনকে কিনে নিয়ে এলো না, মা কি খুশি, পেতলের কলসি একটা।
Growing up on the other side of the country in Punjab, Asiya has similar emotional attachments to objects that constitute her landscape.
बहुत सारी फैमिली हमारे घर आ गई, तो कितने दिन वो रही ये नहीं पता, सुना कितने महीने, वो कुछ 6-7 हफ्ते रही हैं। अच्छा, जिस वक्त 6-7 हफ्ते मेरे अब्बा ने पूरा खाना रखा हुआ था, बोरियां चावलों की, आटा, क्या नाम, दालें, सब कुछ मिर्चें, तो वहां बैठे कुछ काम नहीं था तो खाते रहते थे। भाई कहाँ से ने दुम्बा या बकरा ज़िबा किया था, तो उन्होंने कहा कि तुम इतने लोग रहते तुम भी लेके जाओ। कोई कितने हफ्तों के बाद गोश्त पकाया, तो वो सारा दिन पकाती रही। जब अभी पका भी नहीं था, आग लगी, जल रही थी, आग नहीं पक रही थी, तो क्या हुआ, क्या नाम, मिलिट्री आ गए और मिलिट्री ने कहा कि यू गॉट ओनली 5 मिनट, 5 मिनट है, अगर किसी ने जिंदा रहना है हमारे साथ आ जाओ डॉक्टर को।
So for both Jhorna and Asiya, the mundane cooking pots, these everyday objects, assume a level of significance far beyond their practical use value. The emotional connection they feel with these now lost objects, the emotional connection they saw in their family members for lost objects, help to transform their relationship with the landscape of the past and the landscape of the present. And it seems to me this kind of emotional connection can only ever be discovered through a method of research like oral history. The kind of stories I'm looking at aren't stories about politics. that happen to sort of men in high places, if you like. This is if we are to understand the loss of partition, if we are to understand the effect partition has and had and continues to have on people, we need to take into account these, you know, relatively apparently unimportant things. That this is what people remember. You know, it's 70 years ago, but the importance that cooked meat has, that no one ate, is more important for Farsia and her family than sort of big, large scale ideas like religion or nation or ideology or whatever. As John and Asya demonstrate, partition and its memory is emotional even for those who were born after it but lived with its legacy. KR, for example, she asked me to anonymize her identity, has a powerfully emotional relationship with family members who died in 1947 and therefore whom she never knew. When she discusses their loss, both their death and her mourning is depicted as specifically located in a particular landscape.
Then I just imagine and thinking, oh, my nanny was like that, lying on one side, my auntie, my nana was lying there. People were passing through, perhaps then the bodies start smelling. What happened then? They put it somewhere. Where they gone? These questions come in your mind. They didn't have a place or memorable grave or something we can go. And like my parents' graves there, when I go to visit Pakistan, I go there and pray for them there as well. I pray from here as well, but I go there and I make sure I always visit. I take my children to my mother and father's grave. Something will go there every time. And I go and sit and talk and cry on my mother's grave. But it's nothing for them, no, nothing at all.
In the absence of a marked grave, the imagined remains, bodily remains of her family, haunt the landscape generally, transforming both the land and her emotional relationship to it. The bodies somehow become constitutive of the landscape. They become at one with the land, reminiscent of what scholar Shantanu Das has called the slimescapes of World War I. Dash is writing about the trench warfare in World War I, and writing about the trench mud. He argues that it wasn't really mud, it was compounded of organic wastes, industrial debris, iron scraps, rotting flesh. And it's this combination of half human, half non-human landscapes that characterize oral history interviews of partition. Gurbakhsh's testimony in particular was marked by a number of horrific encounters with the legacies of violence, and encounters which I think force us to think about the role of the body, specifically the role of the body in experiencing violence and then remembering violence. Listen to this memory he has of the horrific transformation that partition wrought on his family's land.
And one of our fields was just on the other side of that road, only about half a mile from our village. And this caravan had spent the night in those fields, including our field there. And after that, when my grandfather had sown the groundnut crop, and that, because it was sandy soil, good for groundnut. And as the plants came up and it was all green field, you could see more sort of luxurious growth over in the shape of human bodies, because the people who had stayed the night and those people who had died during the time were buried, and they just buried them in shallow sort of graves. And we only found out when we saw this growth, luxurious growth on the graves. They acted as fertilizer, the bodies. And my grandfather stood there and just cried to see what had happened in his field.
Partition has not just uprooted people physically, it has transformed their emotional connections to landscape, to home, to material objects. And it does this sometimes by elevating the mundane to the level of the profound, like the cooking pots and so on, and other times by indelibly associating the ordinary with the monstrous, as this example. Listen to Abdul Rashid describing his experience of crossing the border to newly formed Pakistan by train.
Then at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the evening, a train came and we were asked to sit in that train. Make a queue, we were sent in towards the train, whichever carriage, in whichever carriage we went, we saw blood, flesh on the seats. No seat was such where we can sit. There was blood and fresh blood. We think that Muslims are slaughtered in this train. And that train came to us. Now we don't know what will happen to us. Very fear, very fear. Marta kya na karta, baithta, we sit on the bloody seats. Bloody seats. Our clothes were in the blood. When we came in Pakistan, our clothes were colored with blood.
Look at the number of times Abdul Rashid repeats the word blood, narratively connecting the space of the train with the space of the oral history interview, as his otherwise entirely normal living room in 2013 becomes full of the images of the bloodied train from 1947. As I listen to these interviews almost 8 years after they were recorded, it seems today like they're from a whole other world. Unfortunately, many of the people I've interviewed have since passed away. But even apart from that, sitting in 2021, when we're all limited to the spaces of our own home, when our interactions with each other take the form of conversations across phones and screens, this kind of bodily research seems next to impossible. And in this particular context, it becomes all the more important, I think, to recognize the presence of the body in our work. Academic research doesn't happen just in minds, as it were. It needs bodies. For an oral history interview to occur, it is an intensely physical experience. It involves bodies traveling in space. The two bodies have to meet. They experience a shared moment of intimacy, almost always in the privacy and domesticity of somebody's home. This intimacy is felt through the sharing of private stories, secrets communicated through word and gesture, the nodding heads, the shudders, the sighs, the sharp intake of breath, the choked voices, the tears, some of which I hope you've managed to hear in my extracts. But also that there's an importance of space, the particular place where the body, where the interview was located, where these two bodies meet. Another way in which I think the current pandemic is affecting all of our research. And in particular, in moments when we aren't able to do research like this, it seems to me that it is important to hold on to the sense of the oral history interview as an emotional experience. And the importance of emotions in our research. Too often we tend to think of academic research as objective, as dispassionate, but I think emotions are really important. Emotions can be used to fight back against what can be seen as the oppressive normality of nations, of states, of governments. Again and again, my interviewees express a strong emotional connection with the other country, India, Pakistan, that sometimes trumps one's connection to the state of which one is a citizen. Thus, Asya, a proud Pakistani, talks about her family's attachment to Ludhiana in India.
तो अब जो वहां पैदा हुए ना, तो वो अभी तक, जैसे मेरी बड़ी बहन कहती है कि मैं लुधियाने जाना है मरने से पहले के बाद, मैं कहती तो आज क्यों नहीं करके आती, कहती मैंने बस मरने से पहले एक बार जाना लुधियाना। वो मतलब इतना मिस करते अभी तक, वो अभी तक नहीं, माँ भी नहीं, लुधियाना करती मर गई। तो बस ये बहन अभी तक लुधियाना की तो फोटो में देखे थे, वो देखते रहते थे। तो क्योंकि हमारे कानों में हर वक्त लुधियाना लुधियाना की बस, मतलब इंडिया इंडिया ये बस पड़ी रहती थी। तो और कोई घर में बात ही नहीं होती थी।
In a gesture that says as much about connections across borders as it says about a distinctively South Asian form of Islamic identity, Asia's sister is able to compare the ultimate act of pilgrimage to Mecca to visiting one's ancestral home in India. The resultant declaration is almost blasphemous in its rebelliousness. My interviewees could be seen to constitute something of a counter community of emotions. Reading the interviews in this way means that the importance is placed not on the ordered nature of the division of land into coherent, homogeneous nations, which is after all what partition is, but on the disorderly ways in which land evokes emotional connections of fear and horror, yes, but also of fondness, belonging, and nostalgia. One of my interviewees, Mihir, put it much better than I can.
যে আমাদের দেশটা একটা বোধের দেশ, সেটার কোনো ভৌগোলিক সীমারেখা নেই, সেখানে কোনো সঙ্গীনধারী সৈনিক নেই, পুলিশ নেই, সেখানে কোনো কিছু নেই। সেখানে একটা কিছু কিছু জায়গায় কিছু স্মৃতি আছে, আর বেশিরভাগ জায়গায় যে বোধটা আমি পিতৃপুরুষের কাছ থেকে ইনহেরিট করেছি, দেশ নামক একটা বিষয়, সেটা আছে। যে আমি যখন প্রথম দেশ ছাড়ি তখন ওই নোম্যান্স ল্যান্ডে দাঁড়িয়ে আমার একটা কথা মনে হয়েছিল, যে এটা যেমন একটা বিশাল ফাটল, এবং সেই ফাটলের দুপাশে দুটো নির্বোধ রাষ্ট্র যারা সর্বপ্রকারে তোমাকে বঞ্চিত করছে, এর কোনো অর্থ নেই। কিন্তু তৎসত্ত্বেও কি আমার ওই বোধের জায়গাটাকে আমি সে আটকাতে পারছে না।
As India today marches deeper and deeper towards a fascism that is based in part on a violent ordering and aligning of religious and national borders, I look back at the various examples of this feeling called country that are visible throughout my oral history interviews. It is a precious thing, fragile and tenuous, but really, really important. When it is at its most powerful, it can show us a way forward towards using the counter community of emotions to challenge the powers of the nation state. It is characterized by the same emotion that the gentleman in Man demonstrated in his deep desire to go back to see his village. In our different ways, we are all utilizing our memories and experiences to fill in the contours of the feeling called country. As the hegemony across South Asia becomes more and more violent and exclusionary, the potential that the counter community of emotions possesses has never been more essential. Fragile and ineffable this feeling called country might be, but in all its tenuousness, in all its disorderliness, it can generate that most valuable of things, hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raychaudhuri. And now we'll move to the questions, which viewers can type into the chat bar. We'll also be putting a link to our event survey in the chat bar, which we hope you will fill out, as it will help us improve our events in the future. A starter question, Dr. Raychaudhuri. You quote approvingly of a description of India and Pakistan as being dissimilar but conjoined twins, unable to move away or move ahead. What do you think will allow the two countries to move ahead? And what, if any, role does oral history have in achieving that?
It's a big question. It's an important question. I guess one way to start it would be to say, you know, as you correctly pointed out, that a lot of the material I'm dealing with is unpleasant. And I have at multiple points, people have said, why do we carry on indulging in these divisive memories? Why do we not sort of forget, ignore, and come together? And I guess this points to why I think oral history is important, which is that amnesia is not the same as closure, right? We need closure, and in order to get closure, we have to recognize the pain, that was experienced in remarkably similar ways on both sides of the border. And I think, if anything, this is precisely what can allow us to move ahead, which is to recognize that we share much more than divides us, right? Depending on which part of India or Pakistan you're in, you could speak the same language, you can eat the same food, you have very similar customs. I remember having grown up in India, the first time I went to Pakistan was to do these interviews. And I was standing on the Grand Trunk Road, this historical famous road that cuts across most of the northern part of the subcontinent. And I was standing on that road thinking, you know, were it not for the border, and if I had the relevant paperwork, and if I had enough time and money, I could follow that road all the way from the northwest to the east of the subcontinent where my home is. And you sort of realize the fictional nature of the border. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that we could wake up tomorrow and do away with the border. I'm not being naive, I hope. But what I am suggesting is that if we can recognize the similarities of the people, the landscape, the emotions, the memories that across both sides of the border, then that perhaps allows us to move ahead.
Thank you. And now a question from Rohan. How do you think language and religion shape the different emotional responses and reactions on either side of the partition border?
Thank you, Rohan. That's another important big question. I did my interviews. So for those of you who don't know, there are multiple languages across South Asia, upwards of 30, 40. I speak fluently. I speak Bengali, and I can get by in Urdu and Hindi. At least the spoken version of Urdu and Hindi. Those were the main languages I interviewed in. I did some interviews in Punjabi as well, but I'm much less confident in Punjabi. And I mean, on the one hand, what's interesting is how similar the memories are on both sides of the border, as I said before, and I hope I gave a flavor of through my interviews. So the specificities change. You know, what the precise object it is that one has an emotional connection to, that changes. The specificity of the way one describes one's home, the specificity of the way one describes what kind of food one was eating or what kind of food one was traveling with, that changes. But the overall emotional connections that one has towards people, places, objects, locations, that does not change. I don't think language or religion changes that specific, the general format of the way in which we establish connections with one another. I don't think that changes. But the specificity, you know, someone might describe a connection to a cooking pot full of meat. Another person might display a similar connection to a pot of what's called ghee or clarified butter. And, you know, depending on your religion, you might eat meat, you might eat ghee, you might not eat one or the other. So the specificities change, but the overall approach to the way in which we establish connections with lost objects, that doesn't change.
Thank you. This is a question from me where you quoted the words of Claire Barker, that partition narratives are full of images of corporeal dismemberment, tearing, cracking, bleeding, pain. Do you think it's possible to remember such catastrophic personal moments outside of political events, outside time as it were, or are they always informed by this wider context?
I think they're always informed by the wider context, and the wider context is important, but the wider context doesn't necessarily have to remain divisive. I interviewed someone who now lives in Britain, and he said something interesting. He said the generation of people who survived partition, you will see less prejudice among that generation than the following generation. because the generation of people who survived partition realized that everybody lost. There are no winners in partition. There are no good guys. People on all sides did good things. People on all sides did bad things. Is the next generation of people who've grown up only on the "this is what they did to us" narratives, where you see more a lingering after effect of the prejudice. Now, I don't have any scientific evidence to back this theory up, but if it is even halfway accurate, then the way to challenge the "this is what they did to us" narrative is to highlight in as many ways as possible, as many voices from all sides of the border to say, we did good things, we did bad things, they did good things, they did bad things. Let's honor the memories, honor the stories as best as we can.
This is a question from Catherine. What do you think is the relationship between oral history and fiction? Much of what you said reminded Catherine of issues in Palestinian fiction, and much Palestinian fiction draws on oral history.
Thank you.
In terms of the relationship between oral history and fiction.
Thank you, Catherine. That's a really important question and a question close to my heart. I work in an English literature department. I'm not a historian at all. I use oral history precisely to compare with literature in various ways, literature and cinema. I'll give you one very specific example that hopefully will help to explain what I mean. I was doing an interview in Delhi, in India, and I was interviewing this gentleman who was describing something that happened to him. He was outlining this particular experience. And as I'm sitting there listening to him, in my head, I'm going, I know the scene of the film you're talking about. You are describing a particular scene of a particular film. Now, he's not lying. He's not making stuff up. But he's doing what we all do with memories, remembering is a very creative activity, right? We combine things we've experienced with images and stories we've seen in cinema or we've read in a book, and we put them together to form a narrative of memory. And I think that precisely is where the relationship is between literature and oral history, which is one influences another, right? Authors use their memories of people they know to produce fiction, and reading fictional narratives about an event, even if it is an event that I've lived through, helps shape the way I remember it. I hope that answers the question, but for me, it's the fact that the private memory of the oral history and the public memory of a novel or a cinema or a film, the way it works in conjunction, one reinforcing another to create a collectively held memory of the partition or indeed of Palestine, as Catherine referred to. I agree, there are lots of similarities across the Palestinian experience and the partition experience.
This is from Kate. The excerpts today had a lot of grief and fear. Did people speak a great deal about anger about partition? Yes,
Kate, there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger. Often the anger is directed at the other side. You know, this is what Hindus did to me, or this is what Muslims did to me. Often the anger is directed at the government, Indian leaders, Pakistani leaders, Hindu leaders, Muslim leaders. Often the anger is directed at the British rule, for horrendously mismanaging partition. There is a lot of anger. I certainly don't mean to negate it, but in a sense, the anger was something I was expecting when I went to when I started the interviews. What I wasn't expecting is this nostalgic, emotional connection with people and places that they've lost. And what seems to me remarkable is there's a saying that wisdom is the ability to have two thoughts in your head at the same time. It's the ability to coexist with one's anger about, you know, Hindus or Muslims in general as a block of people. This is what they did to me, I'm angry, while also maintaining really important, positive emotional connections with individual members of that group. And it's in that contradiction. Of course, it's a contradiction. We are all masters of contradictions, but it's in that gap that I think that oral history has a really interesting role to play.
Continuing the questions about oral history, an anonymous question was asked about the Partition Museum in Amritsar, which uses a lot of oral history. What do you think is the role it can play, and do you think it needs to be a cross-border effort?
Thank you. Thank you. I should admit at the start that I haven't had the chance to go to Partition Museum. When last time I was in Amritsar, that was before the museum opened. The museum is a relatively recent thing. For the longest time, there was no museum either side of the border. There wasn't even really a proper memorial to this event, which is quite remarkable that it has taken this long for a museum to exist. Museums have a role absolutely in shaping memory, but for it to work as a way of healing as opposed to a way of dividing, it absolutely has to be a cross-border effort. I don't know the museum well enough. As I said, I haven't had the chance to go, but in my judgment, any such museum would have to be a truly cross-border effort that collects as many voices as possible. There have been a number of cross-border oral history projects, some of which are available online, and so there is an increasing effort to collect oral history voices. Of course, the problem is that much of this work should have happened 20 years ago. A lot of the people who I interviewed have since passed away, and my project was later than it should have been. That's not to say there haven't been previous oral history projects. There have been lots of brilliant ones. They just can't ever be enough, I guess.
You mentioned the intimacy of an oral history interview and the exchange of emotions via expression and body language that aren't conveyed either in the recording or the transcription. Zaina asks, what led you to decide to conduct an oral history rather than video interviews? And she asks the second rider question, and were you worried about political fallout from your work?
Thank you, Zaina. Yes, yes, absolutely. To answer the second question first, absolutely, I was aware. I continue to be aware. I will do everything I can to not let my work be appropriated in a way that I feel is counter to my position. But once a work is out there, it's out there. It's to an extent it's beyond your control, but it is absolutely something I worry about. The question about videos is really interesting. When I first started doing the interviews, I did used to take a video camera, partly because the audio recorder I use, I was less comfortable with it at the start because I was still getting used to it, and I was paranoid that I would make a mistake and it wouldn't record, so I'd have the video recording as a backup. But part of the reason I stopped doing the video recording is that, especially for the generation of people I'm interviewing, or I was interviewing, the camera is much more intrusive than a little audio recorder. So as soon as you turn the camera on, if you put the camera in their eye line, their behavior changes completely. And I wasn't able to spend the amount of time I would need to spend with each person doing follow-up interview after follow-up interview to get them used to the camera, which is why I chose not to do a video interview. I did keep notes after the interview, but it doesn't capture everything absolutely, and that is a methodological issue with the oral history interview. The audio recording doesn't capture everything. The transcript captures even less. But the way my guiding principle throughout all the interviews has always been a flawed interview is better than no interview at all. If I can capture some of it, then that's worth doing. these people are entrusting me with their most precious memories and stories, and the more I can do to highlight that, to take it forward, to give it as wide a life and afterlife as possible, the better.
And Prab's asked a question about the diaspora experience. How did folk who moved away, came to the UK, rather than stay in their enforced new lands, describe their experience, especially as they often didn't have family in the new country to support each other?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. So when I started this project, when I applied for funding to get this project quite a long time ago, originally it was going to be a comparison of diasporic memories versus indigenous memories, as it were. So people who stayed in India and Pakistan versus people who came to Britain. Part of the reason that changed was, interestingly, I really couldn't find that much of a difference. The way they remember partition isn't all that different between the people who stayed and the people who moved. What is interestingly different, it's not necessarily directly about partition, but one of the things that happens is, especially for the generation who moves from South Asia to Britain in the immediate aftermath of partition, so in the 1950s, late 40s, early 50s, let's say, and they've come to Britain with all their memories of violence and horror and conflict and all of that. And they come to Britain, and in the face of British racism from the 1950s, they suddenly realize they're just another brown person. British racism doesn't distinguish between Hindus and Muslims. So they're finding themselves having to work together with people from this other community where back home they're literally fighting. They're having to work together to find ways of resisting and ways of survival in a landscape that they experience as racist. And that's a really interesting added layer of complexity, where they often still harbor resentment, they still harbor divisions and prejudices, but they sort of sideline that, going, okay, we're going to have to work together, because if we don't, then we won't be allowed to rent that place where the landlord says, I'll only rent to white, so we won't get that job which will only recruit white people. So that transition from inter-community strife to a cross-community solidarity to fight racism is part of the diasporic story as a response to partition.
I'm just going to wrap up now with a final two questions. One from another anonymous viewer. How do the current governments of India and Pakistan engage with the memory of partition?
Not well, in my judgment. I will speak more about India because I know more about India, having grown up in India. The current Indian government is what is described as Hindu nationalist. So their belief, my understanding is that their belief is that India should be a Hindu state and Muslims don't belong in India. People might disagree with me, but that's my assessment of the situation. And therefore, certainly on the Indian side of the border, partition is used as an excuse to carry on what I would see as racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic government policies. In other words, Muslims don't belong in India because partition happened. Pakistan was created for Muslims. Why don't Muslims just go off to Pakistan? I'm not saying that the Pakistani government is any better at using the history of Pakistan. I don't think it is. Both sides are moving towards more violently exclusionary forms of identity, where religious identity and national identity are being forced to align in a way that doesn't fit. So I guess this connects back to the question about museums. I haven't been to the particular museum in Amritsar, so I'm not speaking about that. But museums in general, I'm a little bit suspicious of if there is the museum sort of give in to the pressure from government to tell the Indian side of the story or the Pakistani side of the story, as opposed to as wide a set of voices as possible.
This is a final question from me. Your next project is a history of vertigo. Is there anything you can share on how that might be? It's a dizzying prospect.
It is a dizzying prospect. I suffer from vertigo myself. That's one reason why I chose to work on it. What's interesting to me about vertigo in an intellectual sense, I'll try to keep this brief, is one of the classical definitions of vertigo, if you look at the sort of NHS web pages and so on, is that it's described as you can't quite tell if you are spinning or the world is spinning. And as someone who suffers from vertigo, I recognize that feeling, that you sort of get the sense that the whole world is spinning around you and you aren't sure if you are spinning or the world is spinning. And I think what vertigo, as a result of that, what vertigo does is a way to help us challenge the boundary between self and other, if you like. Where do I stop and the world start? Or where does the world stop and I start? And that lends itself to be used metaphorically for in a number of different ways across a number of different texts to challenge the relationship between self and the other. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to achieve, where vertigo becomes a way of talking about the anxieties of selfhood. If you've seen Hitchcock's Vertigo, that's an example of, perhaps the most famous example of it doing that, also to do with memory and the past. But that what I'm interested in vertigo is the ways it's described as a balance disorder. And if we think of the word balance as similar to objective or unbiased or neutral, then is there a way of celebrating a kind of radical imbalance where I reject balance as the optimum way of being in the world?
Thank you, Dr. Raychaudhuri. We'd be delighted to invite you back when you're ready to talk through that research again. I'm sure there'll be an equally large audience for that. Apologies to everybody who asked a question which we weren't able to reach. We'll pass those on to Dr. Raychaudhuri, and hopefully he'll be able to get back to you. I'd also like to direct your attention to the survey which is in the chat. If you'd fill that in, that would be greatly appreciated. You can also watch previous Saints talks on our YouTube channel, as well as follow us on our social media channels on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram. And now, just to reiterate my thanks to Dr. Raychaudhuri for his time and sharing his research with all of us. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.